So yeah, this is the topic that I'm going to talk about, the story of Rails. Um, I'm Ratnadeep. On Twitter, I'm RTDP. Maybe that's what will be easy to pronounce as well. I come from India, so I'm the second from the four out of country speakers. So um, I love traveling. Work remotely for a couple of clients as a consultant, and um, apart from that, I also love mechanical keyboards. So if that's one of your things, remote travel, mechanical keyboards, then please find me and we can have a long discussion. So yeah, so this is the place that I come from, Pune, India, pretty close to Mumbai. Uh, on that note, the CFP for RubyConf India is open, so maybe please come. Yeah. So before I start with the story of Rails, I wanted to have or share a story of me when I was here first time. So I was here in 2015, and that was for the Madison, Wisconsin Ruby conference, which is the place that I have shown on the map. And when I was traveling for this conference, what happened was my flight was from Mumbai to New York, and then from New York to Madison, Wisconsin. So I had to clear the customs and everything at the New York itself, and then do a domestic flight to the Madison, Wisconsin. So I thought, if I'm clearing the immigration and entering the country in the New York itself, why not to spend some time there, right? So I called a friend. I had a place to crash, so I decided, let's do that. So um, spent a week, stayed in the New York, worked remotely, and then I went to the Madison, Wisconsin. So spending 2 weeks in US, I was pretty impressed with a couple of things, and obviously cars and automobiles was one of them. Apart from obviously the museums and how they represent the science in a very good ways, and that's why I thought maybe someday Detroit could be an interesting place to visit. So I found a friend there as well, and there was some time between he could be present in Detroit and I can go to his place. So I decided to utilize that week, and I dropped by to the Chicago. So I stayed in Chicago for a week. The Museum of Industrial Sciences was pretty awesome there. And from there, I went to the Detroit, where I again stayed for a week. And in Detroit, the Ford Museum was pretty awesome, right? While I was there, I remembered a couple of textbooks that I have finished in my school days. And it has some history related to the Boston as well, like how the Boston Tea Party happened and whatnot, all the historic places. And I was pretty close to Boston. So there I go. I did a week. I stayed for a week in Boston, and when I was in Boston, I realized that when I was in New York and I had went for a day to the Washington D.C. So the Washington D.C., the national capital area, has like multiple museums, right? And I was there for just a day, so I couldn't complete all of those. So again, a week in Washington D.C., and I completed all the museums. Uh, Next, I had I went to the Miami because one of my colleague was there and I had to meet. So about a 2 week in a Miami, and then while I was in US, I got to know about this conference in Austin that was Keep Ruby Weird. So there was a conference happening with a name Keep Ruby Weird, and how can I not attend that? So there goes a week in Austin, and next was about San Francisco, and then a week in San Antonio because the RubyConf in 2015 happened in San Antonio. So yeah, in short, for the 6 months that I spent in US, I stayed in about 10 different cities and worked remotely. So it was pretty interesting. So the story of Rails and why. The reason the story of Rails should be known to some of the people who are starting or beginning is that it makes easy if you know some of the whys behind a couple of features that are there, right? And now it's been about more than 10 years in Rails has become so big that for some of the people who are just beginning to learn Ruby on Rails, it becomes pretty overwhelming with all those features and stuff. So here just I'm trying to come off with a couple of stories that are there inside the Rails, and hoping that this could help you understand the Rails better. So let's start. So I have created a couple of sections into the story that's there, and one of the first thing is the culture, uh, right? So yeah, so while creating this talk, I went to the Rails doctrine that's written by the DHH, and it's also available on the Rails website. And it's a big article, but the gist of that is the Ruby is for the developer happiness, and Rails is to make them smile. And many of the features and many of the coding practices that you will see throughout the Rails are in line with this philosophy. Here is an example. So this is an example of how you quit from the interactive terminal that is provided to you by these two different languages. One is a Python, second is a Ruby. So if you start Ruby and you want to like interactive console IRB you started and you want to quit from there, you can type quit and it's exited, or you can type exit and you are out of that, right? No big deal. But if you are running on a Python and if you tried exit, it will say no. You have to type exit and the brackets. And if you see the error message, it obviously knows that what you want to do is to exit out of it. But still it will say, no, no, this is not the way. You have to do it this way only, and then only I will understand. So that's the difference, right? Next is, so this is one of the method that is from Ruby Rails 2.3. It was, it used to put people on very, two brackets of opinionated segments. So what you could do with this is find by first name, last name, and email. So you have a user model, and then you can call a method like this, find by, and then append all the models that you have and provide the parameters, and then Rails will do the search for you. It will build the SQL query out of that and do the search. So what's happening here? It's all meta programming. So this is one of the very interesting and what I would say, a good thing to pitch about the Rails. So if you want to impress someone, you show them this query, right? There is no method written, but you know the Rails is written in a such a way that it can write its own methods. So very good. Obviously, it has its performance flaws, and later on it got replicated. But that's the it's one of the examples which represents the ideas and the motives and the philosophies of the people who are building this language. Third example is this, array.42. So, you know, in Rails, you have these convenient methods to access the elements from the array. So you have an array and you can do array.first, array.second, array.third, right? So some other time I was trying to get array.eighth. Obviously that didn't work. So I went into the Rails repository and was trying to see what all methods are available, just the convenient methods, right? So those are defined from the first to fifth element. And in one of the documentations, I saw that DHS also uses these methods when you're trying to do quick debugging on the Rails console. So, and that's the purpose that they are present in the Rails APIs. So when this first time, these first to fifth methods were put and that pull request was there, that pull request was shared on Hacker News as well as on Reddit. And on the Reddit, people were ridiculating this idea of having these convenient methods, even if you have a typical way of accessing the elements of array, which is by having an index, right? So you have an array, you can always say provide 1, 2, 3 in front of with the brackets, and then you can get all the elements, but still you have these, right? So to answer all those trolls and um, go with all the philosophy that the Rails has, DHS also added one more pull request after that, which is array.42. So this one returns the element with the index of 42. And you will know the significance of the number 42 if you have read the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? So yeah, so this is an example that defines what the culture is in the Rails. So this is also a couple of lines taken from that Rails doctrine, and they say that Ruby has been designed with the principle of least surprise to mads, and Rails has been designed with the principle of the biggest smile of DHH. Yeah. And on that, you can also say this is the true, that if the Ruby is the language, then Rails is a kind of a joke that is being told in that language to make you laugh. Yep. Next is a community. So apart from culture, this is the second biggest thing that differentiates Ruby and Rails and this word from the other places is the community, right? So back in 2011 and 12, I was just had begun learning the Rails and Ruby, and I had made a website called as whyloveruby.com. The website is still up. You can go and see all the interesting reasons that people have posted there. So the website was an attempt to collect the reasons from all the people about why they love Ruby. And other people can come in, log in, and they can vote to the various answers that are added by the previous people, right? And the most upvoted answer on that uh, website is this. It was added by the Konstantin Hassi, and it says Ruby is one of the best OSS communities ever. So all the syntax and all the easiness or the metaprogramming or the features of Ruby, everything was there. All those kind of reasons were added into the website, but the most upvotes went to the one that was about the community. So yeah. Next is about the feature. So I just have stories for a couple of features that I want to go with. So first is the bundler that I will be speaking about. So in the very first version of the Rails 1, it was all the plugins, no versioning or the dependencies were present for those plugins. I started work with the Rails 2. My first application was 2.3. It had first class support for the plugins as gems, and it added also the dependencies. So many a time what used to happen, remember these were the days where bundler didn't exist, right? And whenever you have dependencies on any of the gems, you manually added them in your environment file. So here is an example. So gem cutter was the tool that was used back then for creating these gems. So this is the example environment.rb file, and as you can see there, the config.gem is the line from where the gems are specified. So there are a couple of places where the version is also included in the gem, and some places where the version is not included. And what used to happen is, when you are doing the installation, which is generally the reg gems install, it used to fail with gems not being compatible with each other, or their dependencies not being compatible with each other. And in that cases, what you have to do is to find a right dependency between those two and add that as a dependency of your application itself, so that you can log that gems version. Uh, yeah, here is an example. So there are two gems, thin and action pack, and what's happening is, first the thin is required, it's loaded properly, and then the action pack is required, but it couldn't be activated because the action pack depends on the rack 1.0.0, but rack 1.1.1 was already activated by the thin. So even though the action pack and thing don't the application is specifying the versions for the thin and the action pack, their dependencies are different, and because of that, whenever you have to update the application or get a setup from someone else, it used to be a lot of problem. Now combine these issues with the fact that you do not have RVM or RB environment as well, so that even your Ruby versions are if you have say two different applications running on the same machine with the different Ruby versions, then that is also an issue. Combine that with the gems that have a different visual. So that's when the bundler entered. Basically, most important part that it did was provide the per application dependency resolution, meaning that every application, at the very core, there are different Ruby versions, and you can have different Ruby versions with RB environment or RVM. Apart from that, once you have selected the Ruby version and you have a different applications running under that same Ruby version, then the bundler comes in so that it can handle the dependency resolution separately for these two different application. Not just the applications that are specified in your gem file, what it does is it also lists the dependencies of dependencies. So by having that gem file and gem file log, you have all of them listed. And one other thing that was fixed with that is the group of dependencies. So if you are trying to develop with the SQLite on your development machine, and you have a different database on the production for, say for Postgres or MySQL, then you can have a different groups created for these different types of gems, and then decide which machine to install which, and then have all those things. This is not most recommended way of doing it, having two different databases on the development and production, but then this same grouping of the gems can be used for the test cases and to separate out similar kind of business requirements that are there. So yeah. On that note, I remember one of the problems that I personally used to fail in those days, which was whenever you update a gem for a minor version, it's not an issue. But when you update a gem for a major issue, then it used to be a problem. So I remember suggesting a feature wherein rather than just showing what was updated by a bundler, you also show what previous version it had. So here is an example wherein SASS 737, the gem was updated to the version 737, but previously it was 357. And the reason for having the was in the brackets was behind the idea that you get the idea whether it's being updated for a major version or a minor version. Just to give an example, suppose you are depending on a bootstrap gem, and you are depending on say 2.0, which also depends on a bootstrap 2 of a Twitter style sheets and all, and suddenly one day when you are running the bundle update on the bootstrap, if it gets updated to the Ruby 3.0, all your front end will be haywire, because the CSS are completely different in bootstrap 2 and 3, right? So the similar thing could be avoided by having these nodes. So in the features, apart from bundler, the next one is the modularity. And this started with the Rails and Mob. So now it's not anywhere that you get to see or mention of Mob framework. But back in 2008, there were two frameworks. One was the Rails and the other was the Mob. And both of them were being developed at a with a very good teams and a little bit different philosophies. But then finally around 2008, they both the teams decided that it's a good that they combine the forces rather than competing with each other, and that's when the Rails and Merb got merged. So what Merb was like, how Merb was different from the Rails back then was it was just the controller stack, nothing else. It used to have a rack and mongrel for the web server interface, ERB obviously for the views, and the data model for the data mapper for the models instead of active record. And when the merger happened, so these are some of the things. So the merger happened, and the Rails 3 was the first version that came up with MERB included into the Rails, and these are the things that were different. So first was the modularity. Because of the MERB, we have this modularity wherein we can decide which components of Rails to use and which ones to not. Whenever you are creating that Rails application, which is just for the APIs and not for the views, many of the parts of the Rails application are taken out from that. So that kind of a modularity, it came with the mob. Well-defined APIs and the tests were written for the all of that APIs. And the benefit of that is now that the framework has their APIs frozen and all of it is being tested as well, the gem developers and the plugin developers can use and rely on that APIs. Like I remember there were times when the Ruby Rails 2.3 and other of applications were updated to the Rails 3. Many of the applications were not even updated because it was such a big thing to jump from that. Many of the gems that were there in the Rails 2 world didn't had even chance to upgrade to the Rails 3 because maybe like maintainers and the support for those gems wasn't great. But if you see Rails 3 onwards, there isn't anything wherein Rails version has come up, and it generally isn't a big chore to update the gems and the dependencies, and all that comes from the upgrade lessons that were learned into the Rails 3. So performance and scalability, that is also something that MERB was prioritizing very hugely. As in, one of the mottos that they had in the MERB world was no code is faster than no code. You see, yeah. Uh, Next is in the feature is the asset management stories. Like back in the day when the Ruby was Rails was on the 2.3, prototype was the JavaScript library that was primarily into it, and it was made in a such a way so that with the scaffolds as well you can use the Ajax by just specifying one attribute into your forms, and then your forms will be submitted with the Ajax requests. So this is something was very unique and new with the Rails. Like back in 2009 and 10, no other framework used to do that, and client-side frameworks were pretty low. Everything that was being done was with the jQuery. So prototype was pretty revolutionary back then. And then asset pipeline with the Rails 3.1, it provided for the faster and compilation of the assets so that the files and everything could be shorter. And lastly, in the features is the security point of view. So there is also a story related to that. So this is on the 4th March 2012. And what happened is there was a hacker, Homakov, who was trying to submit couple of security issues to the GitHub as well as to the Rails community, but somehow the GitHub team didn't listen to him. He says that they also pointed fingers to the Rails and said that it's a general practice and everything. So in the end, his security notifications were not provided any heed to, and that's when he decided to do something different. So what he did, he created a commits on the Rails master without having access to the repository or without being part to the Rails team members, right? And so that's this one is a simple one, like another showcase of a Rails apps vulnerability. Apart from these, he also he also added couple of comments on the same issue with the DHS's account. So you see, if Rails and the flagship application, one of the flagship application of the Rails, which was GitHub back in the day, if those things could be hacked in a such a easy way, what would have been the chaos back then? So that's when the mass assignment and um, uh, it was discussed, it was debated, and finally what you see is the strong parameters of today, it came from that. So it was a lesson learned hard way. Here is an example of mass assignment security bug that generally happens. So here is a current user assigned to the user.update attributes and then params. Uh, this was the old way of saving the parameters or updating a model. And as you can see, the parameters are just a username John. So this is the ideal way in which we want to update the user. So simple form, right? But what happens if someone sends this data instead of sending just the username John? If someone sends password which is say, gotcha or anything, then it's also updating the password, and that was the problem. And the solution to that was the strong parameters. So many a times I have seen that when the people are trying to learn Rails, they ask or can't explain why you have to permit the parameters and why the issues or the exceptions are raised because of that. If it's such an important thing, then these are the reasons behind that. So even if someone tries to submit something that shouldn't be updated, the strong parameters make sure that it's not getting into your application. So, and then some more security. Like here is an example wherein many of the people who are just starting with the Rails get stuck, and then they try to reason why something like that is happening. Invalid authenticity token. So this is for the CSRF protection, and um, you know, the point that I want to drive from this is this one, that Rails is not just the opinions and a directory structure, but it's much more than that. So for example, if you are trying to build a web application in any of the say different languages, say Node, and if you are trying to use a framework from there, there are many things that will be different from Rails. And when you are using Rails, sometimes you fail to appreciate what other features are present in the system that you are not aware of. For example, XSS, CORS, UTF-8 encoding for all the data that is coming into the application, and for all the data that is going out of application, the encoding is by default handled by the Rails. Apart from that, SQL injection related security issues or fixes, that is also handled by default. Whenever an HTML is being rendered into your browser, that is also made safe, right? So yeah, so that's it. On the conclusion side, I would say these are some of the stories that I had to share, and yeah. So Mads is happy, and DH is also enjoying the reels. So probably rather than looking at the conclusions, I would rather show some of the nostalgia slides from the past. So if any of you have been into Rails world for quite long, you will feel the nostalgia of all these things. So this is the Rails website from 2008. Uh, this is how the API documentations looked back then, and this is the website where most of the Rails developers started their Rails journey, Rails casts. Thanks for discussions to a couple of people who helped creating some of these stories. Yeah, thank you.